Hi, welcome to Prime Recap. While conducting geological research on a newly discovered island, a group of scientists awaken a gorilla of colossal stature that takes out all the helicopters, forcing the few survivors to set off on an extremely dangerous journey to the extraction point. Today we will recap the story of the movie Kong, Skull Island. In 1944, in the middle of the South Pacific, two aircraft are in an aerial confrontation when the American pilot ends up having his plane shot down, having to eject to survive the crash. He sees that the Japanese plane has also been shot down and runs to the place where the rival pilot is falling to try to hit him, but misses all his shots, runs out of ammunition, and has to run to avoid being hit by the enemy. When both are out of bullets, the Japanese pilot grabs his machete and runs after his rival until they are facing a cliff, forcing the American soldier to face him even though he is unarmed, holding the blade with his bare hands. The Japanese soldier, still at an advantage, comes close to eliminating the other soldier with his wakizashi. However, at that very moment a giant gorilla hand appears on the horizon, almost hitting both of them at once. In 1973, during the Cold War, two employees of a company called Monarch arrange a meeting with the senator and show him satellite images of a skull-shaped island that had never been detected before. In an attempt to convince the politician to pay for an expedition, Bill says that there is something unknown on the island that has brought down planes and sunk several ships nearby, but the senator shows no interest and walks away. To convince him, geologist Brooks says that the Russian satellite will also pass by the island and that in 3 days they will already have the same images as they do, so not sponsoring an expedition would be leaving the Soviets one step ahead in the Cold War. Convinced by the scholar's argument, the senator accepts the request and says that he will arrange a ride for them, as well as a military escort. At Da Nang Air Base in Vietnam, the last American platoon is leaving the country after the end of the war, but because of Monarch's request, the general in charge calls Colonel Packard to ask him and his men to transport the scientists to the new island, postponing the military's return home. In Saigon, also in Vietnam, Bill decides he will also need a tracker and goes to a bar to hire James, a former British Army captain who is extremely skilled in the art of tracking, and who now spends his days drinking in bars. Upon learning of the mission, James begins to list everything that can eliminate them on the island and asks for 5 times what the scholars offered, plus a bonus if they return alive. Knowing that they need him, Bill and Brooke accept the conditions and close the deal, but when the captain asks what exactly he is supposed to track, the Monarch leader lies, claiming that he does not have the map of the island and that he needs his skills to guide the group around the place. In Thailand, a photographer named Mason learns about the expedition and asks to accompany them, taking responsibility for recording all the discoveries with her camera. The next morning, the mission members meet at the port of Bangkok and the supervisor tells them a little more about the island, saying that it is surrounded by a perpetual storm system and is therefore totally isolated, but that thanks to Colonel Packard's helicopters, they will be the first humans to cross to the other side. Explaining a little more about the mission, Brooks goes to the projector and says that they will enter the southern coast of the island, firing some seismic explosives that will cause vibrations throughout the region, helping to map the subsoil of the place. Finally, Major Chapman says that the interference caused by the storm will block all contact with the outside world, leaving them on their own until the resupply team arrives in the northern part in 3 days. With everything explained, they start sailing towards the island, but when they get closer, the supervisor realizes that the storm is even bigger than it seemed and suggests postponing the mission, starting a discussion about what to do. Since there is a small area of low pressure, Colonel Packard decides to take a chance and orders his men to get the helicopters ready, leaving in the direction of the super turbulent storm. However, after a few minutes of shaking all around, they cross the giant cloud and finally arrive on the island, revealing a beautiful sunny landscape. While flying over the place, the military find a flat area and decide to land to set up the measuring equipment. With everything ready, the colonel's men begin firing the seismic warheads, causing tremors that indicate that the bedrock of the island is practically hollow. But as they fire the bombs, a giant tree flies towards them, crossing one of the helicopters in midair. In another aircraft, the crew members watch the crash as a colossal hand strikes them, bringing down yet another vehicle with extreme ease. As soon as the aircraft plummets to the ground, that gigantic gorilla appears and grabs the vehicle with his bare hands, shaking it in the air until the crew members fall into his mouth. Completely in shock, the other helicopters approach and form a circle around the primate, firing with everything they have, but this only serves to make him even angrier, causing the creature to dismantle one of the vehicles with a single punch. While all this is going on, Chapman is maneuvering when the primate tries to grab him by the tail rotor and ends up having his hand cut off by the blades, but the helicopter is damaged and begins to fall totally out of control. At this point, Colonel Packard manages to locate an aircraft with survivors and orders his men to go there to help them, but they are all crushed by the gorilla just as the rescue unit arrives, causing even more casualties. Furious, the primate lunges forward towards Packard while being machine-gunned by his men, but at the last moment before the collision, the gorilla moves out of the way, revealing that another helicopter was also firing behind him, causing both to destroy each other in midair, crashing immediately afterwards. As soon as he hits the ground, the colonel manages to remove his belt and tries to help his co-pilot, but just as he approaches, the creature grabs the helicopter with one hand and flings it into another aircraft, leaving Packard in shock. Chasing the military who are on the ground, the primate slaps one soldier so hard, hitting the propeller of the helicopter. Mason and James are in and causing them to plummet uncontrollably. After crushing down all the aircraft, the gorilla finally leaves, and the captain's skills can come in handy. Observing with binoculars, he realizes that they are very close to a river on the south side of the island, so they just have to follow the water in a northerly direction and they will reach the collection point on the coast. A few miles away, Packard is using the radio to search for survivors when Chapman answers, saying that he is the only one from his helicopter who made it out alive and that he is 4 kilometers west of the highest mountain. But the radio stops working as soon as he finishes passing the coordinates, leaving him totally incommunicado. Walking around the island, Packard finds some more of his soldiers and gets the dog tags of everyone who has died, finally getting a sense of how many men he has lost. Furious, the colonel walks over to Bill and sits down next to him, drawing his pistol and ordering the expedition leader to tell him everything he knows. Out of options, Bill reveals that more than 20 years ago, the ship he was touring with his family was shot down by the gorilla and he was the only survivor, but obviously no one believed him when he tried to tell other people. Determined to prove he was telling the truth, the man created the monarch and has been studying legendary creatures ever since, but since he never succeeded in his quest, he decided to return to Skull Island and prove he was telling the truth once and for all. To do this, he brought everyone to the island and started firing the seismic warheads to make the gorilla come out of its hiding place, thus getting pictures of the creature, as well as several witnesses to prove the reality. Even though he knows that his men died because of Bill, the colonel lets him stay alive and harbors even more hatred for the giant overalls, deciding that after rescuing Chapman, they will go to the supply helicopter that is loaded with weapons and ammunition, as well as lots of explosives to finish the job. Before leaving, Packard holds a funeral for his men and vows revenge, starting on a long walk to recover the weapons, but when they are passing through a forest of bamboo, one of the soldiers stops to drink water and ends up being perforated by a type of extremely bizarre giant spider. Frightened, the men start shooting upwards, causing the spider to release its web all twisted to capture Mills. Trying to save his friend, Packard and the other soldiers use their knives to cut the creature's legs off and get it closer and closer to the ground. With much sacrifice, Mills manages to cut the webs and plummets to the ground, allowing the soldiers to shoot the spider without the risk of hitting him. Thanks to this, they manage to eliminate the mutant arachnid and are finally able to continue their journey, but deeply shaken after so many losses. On the other side of the island, Brooks tells what he knows to the other group, saying that Bill hired him because of his articles about the Hollow Earth. According to him, there are several passages that connect the outer world with the inner world, and the island is one of them, serving as an access for monsters to invade our reality. Following the river, they continue walking towards the meeting point when suddenly a gigantic buffalo with several horns appears in front of them, making Slivko extremely apprehensive. Realizing that the creature is harmless, James tells everyone to remain calm and orders the recruit to lower his weapon, letting the creature depart safely and making his way northward. After walking for a few kilometers, the group finds the ruins of a temple and begins to explore the place, but is soon surrounded by a group of natives with spears. Suddenly, a rather odd old man comes out of the crowd and introduces himself as Lieutenant Hank, that American pilot from 1944. Lost since the height of the Second War, the man has spent the last 29 years on the island with the natives, living in a small village where the people have adopted Kong as a kind of protective deity. According to Hank, the people of the island lived in fear of the creatures around them, until one day Kong's parents appeared and began to protect them, but after numerous battles with the other monsters, the couple eventually died and their son became the king of the island, adopting the natives as his subjects and taking on the mission of protecting the humans. For the lieutenant, this is why the gorilla attacked them, because the warheads they dropped woke up several of these creatures at once, forcing Kong to fight several enemies in a short period of time. Luckily, the greatest of them all is still asleep, resting after the fight in which he eliminated the mutant gorilla's parents, but it's only a matter of time before he wakes up, and Kong may no longer be alive by then. On the western part of the island, Major Chapman is washing his wounds in a lake when the giant primate appears on the horizon, causing the soldier to run after a rock like a frightened little boy. Hidden away, Chapman sees the gorilla drinking water when a colossal squid appears and Kong begins to fight with it, crushing its head and devouring the creature's tentacles, leaving for the lair with the gigantic animal in his hands. Back in the village, James tells them about the rescue team and invites Hank to go north with them, but since he knows the island like the back of his hand, the lieutenant says that if they continue on foot, it is impossible to reach the rendezvous point in 3 days. To solve this problem, Hank shows the boat he was building with the remains of the 2 planes, but since the Japanese pilot was devoured by one of the mutant lizards, he gave up on continuing his creation, leaving the Gambit stalled until now. While the men are working to fix the boat, Mason is photographing the natives when she starts to hear a mooing sound coming from afar. While out investigating, the woman finds one of those giant buffaloes with its head stuck on one of the helicopters and decides to try to save it, making every effort to lift the fuselage and free the creature, but as the human is unable to help, it is Kong who appears to save the day, grabbing the helicopter with one hand and throwing it away as if it were nothing. On his way west, Colonel Packard is marching with his men when he finds a giant blood mark on the wall, which makes it clear that they have hurt the primate before and gives them even more hope of being able to eliminate it. A few miles away, Chapman is trying to communicate with the colonel when he realizes that the log he is sitting on is actually a living creature. With the jolt, the major ends up dropping his M16 and has to run to pick it up, landing several shots in the head of the animal that was actually harmless. Realizing that the beast doesn't try to attack, the major stops shooting and watches as it leaves, not noticing when one of those lizards approaches from behind and devours his head. After spending more than 24 hours tinkering with the boat, the group in the village finally manages to start the vehicle and set off northward, filling Hank with hope of returning to civilization. While sailing upstream, the radio finally comes back on and they receive a call from the colonel's group, asking them to fire a flare so they can finally meet again. Quite happy, the group on the boat begins to celebrate when suddenly, a group of pterosaurs picks up the supervisor and begins to carry him higher and higher, dismembering his body in midair while Hank and the others watch helplessly. Even after the casualty, they know they cannot give up and continue sailing towards the rest of the group, mooring at the riverbank where they wait until they arrive. With everyone gathered, the colonel tells them that Chapman is still alive and says that he will continue heading west to rescue him, but Hank replies that this direction is where the lizard's main nest is and that they will need more men if they want to go there. Since the lieutenant has known the island for many years, Mason agrees with him and says they should leave, bringing reinforcements later, but Packard manages to convince James to keep looking for the major, saying that his main role in the group is as a tracker. Even though it is a bad idea, they head west and find the place where the bodies of Kong's parents are, a kind of open-air grave full of sulfur. Unable to see properly, the group starts to cross the valley relatively calmly, but halfway through, one of the soldiers releases a cigarette on the gunpowder on the ground, exploding the chemical element and drawing the attention of the bizarre creature. To throw off the predator, part of the group hides in Kong's mother's skull while the others run behind the other skeleton's hip. When it gets close to James, the demented reptile begins to choke and ends up dropping Chapman's skull along with his nameplate, making James realize that there are no other survivors besides them. Barely able to move, the captain waits for the creature to move away and comes out of hiding along with the soldiers, but before he can say anything, Bill starts taking some pictures and his camera ends up breaking, taking countless pictures and shooting flashbulbs that draw the lizard back. After the creator of the expedition is swallowed alive, the armed forces fall into formation and wait for the creature's next attack, especially Hank, who, being familiar with the creatures, can dodge them quite easily and shoves his machete into the lizard's leg, opening a gigantic crack in the animal's paw. To end the battle once and for all, the military begin to shoot the lizard with their might as it runs full speed towards the soldier and devours him, gun and all. Soon after this, the giant creature starts chasing Mason, trying to turn her into his afternoon snack. But Packard manages to defend her by sending one of his men with a flamethrower. Furious, the creature hits its tail on the soldier, which sends him flying away, throwing him into Kong's father's skull and exploding the fuel tank on his back, activating the gas grenades nearby. To save Slivko, who is unconscious in the smoke, the captain borrows his machete and a protective mask and runs towards the recruit, slicing through the dozens of pterosaurs that appear, until he finally reaches the boy, but the giant lizard hasn't given up yet and rushes headlong towards them, forcing Mason to throw his lighter into the gunpowder and blow up the creature on impact. After the battle, Hank says that they are in monster territory and that this was just the first of them, recommending again that they return, but as the colonel refuses to do so, James reveals that Chapman is dead and shows his nameplate. Still, Packard says that this doesn't change anything and that they will continue west to get the weapons and end the gorilla's life, avenging his platoon. But Hank says that this is stupid and explains that Kong is the one who keeps the lizards underground, so if they eliminate him they will only be leaving the island to the lizards. Even with the warnings, the colonel doesn't seem to mind and says that he will eliminate every single monster in this accursed place, starting with the gorilla. Refusing to allow this, the lieutenant draws his machete and aims in Packard's direction, but is easily disarmed by him. Realizing that someone will end up dying in this discussion, James decides to intervene and says that he will take the civilians to the north coast while the military head west towards the helicopter, splitting the group in two again. After walking around all afternoon, the soldiers find Chapman's belongings and begin to prepare an ambush for the gorilla, ending only in the middle of the night. On the other side of the island, James and Mason are looking for the boat and decide to climb the hillside to get a better view, finding the boat in the middle of a bend in the river ahead, but while they watch, Kong appears in front of them and starts sniffing them, allowing the photographer to touch him without showing any reaction. Amazed, the two stand admiring the creature as the military begins to explode the seismic warheads, attracting the gorilla's attention once again. Knowing that he is walking straight into an ambush, Mason and James decide that they will help him and set off in the direction of the soldiers along with Hank. Still, the monster manages to survive and comes out of the river overcome with hatred, throwing the scalding water over one of the men and crushing the other mercilessly, but he has no more strength and ends up fainting totally exhausted. Seizing the opportunity, Packard prepares the explosives and places them all around the creature, but just as he is about to detonate, Hank and the others arrive and manage to stop him, aiming their weapons straight at the colonel's head. Realizing how blinded their leader has been by the desire for revenge, Slivko and the other soldiers turn on Packard, ordering him to release the detonator, but at that very moment, the lizard that eliminated Kong's parents appears in the middle of the lake and everyone starts running, leaving the colonel alone with the two monsters. Seizing the opportunity, Packard takes the detonator and prepares to activate it, but the gorilla realizes the intentions of the demented lunatic and crushes him with his fists. As he is badly wounded, the Gorilla King falls quite easily and the humans have to run to the edge of the island to have any chance of escaping. To try to get the rescue's attention, James asks Mason to climb the nearest hillside and fire a flare while he and the other soldiers are responsible for buying time. Just as she begins to climb, the lizard approaches and one of the soldiers decides to sacrifice himself to finish it off by taking the pins out of his grenades and staying behind to be devoured by the creature, but he dies in vain, because instead of trying to eat him, the demented monster strikes him with a blow with his tail that causes him to explode against the mountain. At that moment, Kong arrives and hits the lizard on the head with a super high, but the lizard is practically unharmed, and then he bites the gorilla's neck. To get free, he grabs the monster by the jaw and starts to open it, almost splitting its body in two, but the creature manages to get free and bites Kong's arm, wrapping his body around it and knocking him to the ground. At that moment, the gorilla grabs a tree and removes the branches to turn it into a kind of club, hitting a log so hard that it shatters the wood. Still, the deformed alligator stands upright and rolls over the primate's body, throwing him into the ruins of an old ship and leaving him trapped in the chains. Even trapped, Kong does his best to keep fighting but can't get free, but just when it seems like the end, Brooke arrives with the contraption they call a boat and starts machine gunning the creature, causing it to turn its attention to the humans. As the lizard advances, Mason fires the flare that hits the creature right in the eye, leaving it partially blind. Kong makes as much effort as possible and manages to free himself from most of the chains, but one of them remains attached to his arm, connecting him to the propeller of the old ship. The primate throws the piece of metal at the lizard's shoulder and uses the chain to squeeze the rival's neck, throwing it against the hillside where Mason is. But this ends up knocking the girl unconscious into the water. Taking advantage of the distraction, the stumpy reptile advances towards Kong, who manages to land several blows on its head, as well as opening a huge crack in the animal's throat that causes it to faint instantly. With that, the Gorilla King manages to stick his hand in the water and save Mason, but just when he thinks everything is solved, the lizard returns once again and rolls his tongue around the gorilla's fist, swallowing his hand with the photographer still inside. Thanks to his frightening strength, King Kong manages to pull his arm out and tears the entire muscle of the demented reptile, finally avenging the death of his parents. With this, everyone is safe and they make a pact never to tell about what happened on the island, allowing the largest of the primates to live their lives in peace and they can finally return to their homes, especially Lieutenant Hank, who sees his wife again and meets his only son after 29 years. So what did you think of this movie? Leave it in the comments below. And if you liked the video, please like and subscribe for more movie recaps. See you next time.